Good evening. I'm Robert Polito from the New School Writing Program, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Cave Canem's Poets on Craft with Tina Chang and Ross Gay. Tina's new book of Gods and Strangers, I understand, will be out in the fall, and Ross Gay's new book, Bringing the Shovel Down, is just out, as I understand. I'd like to thank all of our friends at Cave Canem, particularly Allison Myers and Camille Rankine. And what I particularly love myself about these Poets on Craft events is the way that they combine a reading with a discussion of the art and the life of the poet. And Cave Canem comes up with these incredibly inspired pairings, and this is another instance of it. So please join me now in welcoming Camille, who will introduce the rest of the evening. And thank you all for coming.
Hi, everyone. My name is Camille Rankine, and I'm the Program and Communications Coordinator for Cave Canem Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with Cave Canem, we're a national organization dedicated to cultivating the artistic and professional growth of African American poets. And since 1996, Cave Canem has been working to build a home for Black poetry in many sites across the country. We have a lot of great programs coming out throughout the year, including a reading next week, Friday, April 22nd at NYU, featuring Cave Canem Fellows Shane Book, Kamau Rucker, and Demetrius Worley. You can pick up more information about us at the table in the back, where you can also sign up for our mailing list, and you can always visit our website at cavecanempoets.org to find out what we're up to and ways to support Cave Canem. So I'd like to start out by thanking our hosts and co-sponsors, the New School for General Studies, especially Robert Polito and Rory Lynn Turner for helping us put this together and hosting us. And also thanks to our funders, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York Community Trust, Lila Atchison Wallace Fund for the Arts, and the Greenwald Foundation. And of course, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Cave Canem's Poets on Craft series was launched in 2008 to showcase the work of accomplished poets in the early to mid stages of their careers and provide an opportunity for readers and writers to deepen their engagement with exciting new directions in American poetry. Tonight, we're excited to feature Tina Chang and Ross Gay. And we'll start off with the brief readings, followed by a moderated conversation and time for Q&A at the end. And then I hope you'll join us afterwards for reception and buy the poet's books from Monica Hand right back there at the back table. And I'm sure they'll be willing to sign for you at the end as well. So I'm just going to start out by introducing our poets, then we'll start off with the reading. Brooklyn Poet Laureate Tina Chang is the author of two poetry collections, Half-Lit Houses and Of Gods and Strangers, forthcoming from Four-Way Books in the fall. Poet Maria Howe says of her work, Tina Chang is writing to the future, from the past, towards the present, and all the way back again. She has received awards from the Academy of American Poets, the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, the Ludwig Vogelstein Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, Poets and Writers, and the Van Leer Foundation. She teaches poetry at Sarah Lawrence College. Cave Canem Fellow Ross Gay is the author of two collections of poetry, Against Which and Bringing the Shovel Down, which was just released by University of Pittsburgh Press. Poet Terence Hayes calls Gay some kind of brilliant latter-day troubadour whose poetry is shaped not only by yearning, but also by play and scrutiny, melancholy and intensity. They're recipient of a James Hearst Poetry Prize, a new Millennium Poetry Prize, and the Sow's Ear Poetry Prize. He's a professor at Indiana University and teaches in the low residency MFA program at New England College. Oh, actually, isn't that Drew? I don't know why I have Drew. New England College is definitely Drew. So sorry, that's Drew. Please join me in welcoming our first poet of the evening, Tina Chang.
Thank you. It's so nice to see all these familiar faces today, my students, fellow writers. It's so nice. Thank you, Cave Canem, and thank you, New School, for having me here today. And I'm very excited to be reading with Ross Gay. I feel like I've been sort of chasing his ghost or something for a long time, just, always kind of in the same room, almost kind of, but never quite getting there. Now we're finally in the same room, so I'm really excited. It's so nice to meet you. I feel like in terms of thinking about today, I was thinking about how I feel so much at a midway point. You're sort of at the stage where you sort of long past your first book. My first book came out in 2004, and then I was really consumed with this project, a Norton anthology called Language for a New Century, and it focuses on poetry from the Middle East and Asia and here in the U.S. And then after that, I became very consumed with this second book, which seemed to be a book that travels. It takes place in Haiti and Sri Lanka and Ethiopia, and it's such a movement away from the more sort of domestic concerns of the first book. So I feel very much in the middle, and I feel like I'm just kind of waiting for the new book to sort of hatch in the fall. So I'm very excited to be reading poems in progress, and then also poems from the new book, as well as maybe one or two from the first book as well. I realize that in the past, you're either in one camp or another, where you kind of like it when poets introduce their poems, or you sort of hate it when they introduce their poems. And I realize I'm sort of in the first camp, where if I have access to the writer, I appreciate it when they sort of let me know something about their poems before they read them, because I feel like that's why we have the poet there in front of us, as opposed to a very direct reading, and that's a different kind of experience with the book. This first poem is called Patience. My stepfather had passed away about 1.5 years ago, and it was a very difficult relationship, and I realized that at the moment that he passed, I was pregnant with my first child, and we were so distant and far from each other that he didn't even know of my circumstances and the fact that I was pregnant. That's how sort of distant we were from each other. So it's a poem that tries to reconcile this relationship with him, which was intricate at best. Patience. I come from gravel falling from the mouth, a bent spine from which my mother rose, from the sickness that poured over my father in water buckets. That was the well he fell into, and the well where I waited, a body cutting into water on impact. I come from the story of chicken breeders, of nurses, of railroad, bone soup, chopping block, the work of chopping, then finally food. I come from handmade shirts hanging in my stepfather's closet. I come from the spit and curses that careened from his mouth like anvils and vespers. He is gone now. I come from the broad birds and the day demons, the ash from a childhood burn, tin cans of dry pens, newspapers, seashells, a phoenix fixed in a souvenir bottle, every bit of it saved as if discard were memory itself. I come from the dead end that opened toward the brick face of a horizon which glowed like God's goat face, a wild compassion, a guttural sound from the throat. I come from the last funeral, my stepfather in a casket with all the living flowers, his hands sewn together in death, though I remember in life they waved with rage, punctuating each dirty vowel. How the orchids overwhelmed his body, face so sunken it deflated into the silk cushion behind his head. And was that legacy? He screamed his lessons often into wind, belly jiggling as he laughed. His full face was a red truck swerving off-center, face of my past. I come from that too, from the indifference of doors and keys, from the sonnet of the sewing machine which wrestled my neck at the collar, and all of my words caught at the throat, struggled to make one stitch, a straight line. I come from those birds, heron, robin, grackle, the ones you cannot catch, the ones that sound like owls or witches. I dream of the phoenix and swan fighting, color and frenzy swirling in waves of feather theater in air. I come from the rough seas of this sort of battle, of consequences all too familiar and fantastic. It is a place I cannot swim, where I gulp the world's water, salt with rage, froth with effort. I come from that. The flailing struggle, my afterlife waiting for me, and a future summoning at my ankles. The future is an animal waiting to pounce. It is that bestial, that patient. I come from that, too. I think I'm going to read, that is a poem that's sort of hovering. It hasn't really found its home anywhere, maybe in my third manuscript. But these next set of poems are from the next book that's coming out. And I realize that in rereading some of them, I'm really kind of obsessed and interested in the story of girls. This next one is inspired by an artist residency that I attended. And for those of you who maybe have never attended an artist residency, it's a place that you sort of go. And one of my friends who I know here is a person I met at an artist residency, a place where you go to sort of forget about all of your problems and you're taken care of. And if you're lucky enough, they'll cook you food. And if you're really lucky, they'll do your laundry. And it's just sort of like a summer camp for artists. So we were there, and we were trying to get acquainted with one another. And a young man was standing there, and I guess he was sort of an awkward poet. And he was telling the story of how he often went to the woods and shot and killed his own food. And he asked if any of us did, and none of us, of course, did. And so he went and described from beginning to end how to sort of gut an animal. And I was thinking, and then everybody dispersed very quickly right after he described it. So I was thinking that must be food for some sort of poetry. So this is called Wild Invention. This is a story about a girl who ran all night after the wolf, aimed at its hind legs, then stood above it, shot it between the eyes, skinned it until the soul of the animal departed from this world. Then the meat stopped pulsing. Then it shined with all its delicate possibilities. The girl stalked the forest with nothing but a shotgun and compass due north, hollowed the animal under moonlight. Desire dripped into a tin pan. The stars leaked a tonic into her cup. Her appetite was the forest she traveled. Though lost, she dragged the wolf with her, a past surrendering to a new life. The sun emerged over the mountain like a heart flayed open, with a light in the middle. The animal must be shot. You must be hungry enough to skin it without flinching, must be willing to cook it still trembling over the watchful eye of the fire. You must also be willing to track yourself down, kneel beside the will of a maker who made all beasts fear for their end. The rabbit quivers in its white coat, raises its ears and takes off. The boar bursts from its hind legs, escaping the hillsides. You eat, grateful for the skin that keeps this life intact, under the roof beams of your long life, under a bridge that is a heaven of deer bones. You are a more beautiful animal than you could ever imagine, great flying loon, foxes coupling in the dark brush. This is also called Story of Girls. I must admit, I was thinking of Marie Howe. Has anybody read her sort of newest book, Kingdom of Ordinary Time? Has anybody read? If you haven't, it's just a wonderful book, and I hope you rush out to read it. This is called Story of Girls. I'm sure it's channeling her in some way. Years ago, my brothers took turns holding down a girl in a room. They weren't doing anything to her, but they were laughing, and sometimes it's the laughing that does enough. They held the girl down for an hour, and she was crying, her mouth stuffed with a small red cloth. Their laughing matched her crying in the same pitch. That marriage of sound was an error, and the error kept repeating itself. There were threats of putting her in the closet or in the basement if she didn't quiet down. One cousin told them to stop, but no one could hear him above the high roar. After that, the boy was silent, looking down at his hands, gesturing toward the locked door. The mother was able to push the door in, and the boys were momentarily ashamed, remembering for the first time that the girl was their younger sister. The mother ran to the girl, fearful that something had been damaged. Nothing was touched. The brothers were merely dismissed as they jostled each other down the long staircase. The girl sat up to breathe a little, and then a little more. But oftentimes, it's the quiet cousin I think about. Let me just see. The next one I will read is called Baguio. I was lucky enough to visit the Philippines, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. Jessica Hagedorn, who's a Filipino-American writer, had written this really astounding book called The Dog Eaters. And so I became obsessed with this idea of the dog eaters, and I very naively, when I went to visit the Philippines, had asked, do people in the Philippines actually eat dog? And so there was silence, and they weren't answering me because probably the question was so naive. But then one of the people in this sort of group kind of took me to this market and sort of showed me sort of the answer to the question. There are a couple of words here. Baguio and Cebu are two cities in the Philippines. And jeepneys are these beautiful graffiti-decorated jeeps that they're a cross between a jeep and a bus, and you sort of have to just grab them as they whiz by, and it kind of just drops you off. You sort of have to jump off where you want to land and be. So this is called Baguio. Each one calls the other crazy, bent down to tend a bright need. The butchers with their smeared aprons croon with knives. The dog's face hovers, skin lighter than you would imagine, unraveling like transparent paper, halo stacked in a corner. I listen to the expert humming of the butcher who sings while he cuts. I would like to think that we did not come here to say goodbye. My leaving you is the swinging single bulb above these bones, where I remember myself in this alleyway with you. I'm averaging that I love you best once the animal has been stripped, teeth bare and meat singing too. I imagine the pig's face and the cow's face existing side by side on the farm beyond this town, their blank stares as they are shepherded into the truck. I want to go to Cebu tomorrow. Instead, we'll ride in air-conditioned taxis. Instead, we'll watch the maid wax the floor with a monstrous machine. The day we fought, the rains came down and I rode a jeepney alone through a city I didn't know. What is this force that makes me continually lost? What is it that I want in all these disappearing cities? One street led to another until it was night, until I got off with bags in my arms, food in cartons, sauces dripping, stumbling in the direction of my great need. And this is my final poem that I'll read. I almost never get a chance to read this poem, probably because it has the word sex in it. So then I'm sort of embarrassed to read it coming from sort of the background that I do. You're not even really supposed to utter that word that much. So this one's called Sex Gospels. It's actually quite a long poem, but I'm reading just small little sections of it, making it easier for me to digest the word sex. So this is called Sex Gospels. 1. For days I've been looking for you to reach to me as you did in our other life. 4 whiskeys later, there is a gun. It made me reel, thought of your grasp on metal, the trigger, no bullets, square of light through the half-closed window. People go about their own business on the street, and I am inside with a different belief in hunger, licking the residue of anything left inside me that was good or worth saving. 3. Time so domestic it lay on its side like a dog. Garments dissolve in the ferocious light by the bureau, the couch in the corner. You pull me aside as you enter, after your long day's work, suited, the knot in your tie fully wound. I am making my awful dinner of peas and gray steak, a rush, a flutter of papers on the desk, no words or graces, rummage for flight. We tear them down, the curtains, topple the chairs, and when it's over, heaving, clinks from the fireplace as if pigeons were caught inside the flue, a sound that startled me when I lifted my ear from the floor. 5. I've watched the train move in me 35 years through New York, Pittsburgh, Maryland, D.C., Taiwan, Indonesia. I'll arrive home by evening, breathing through my one good heart. Invisible bandits stand by the tracks, ready to take what we value most. You walk in my future, instructions memorized for my destiny, blueprint of the locomotive as we slip through canyons. I'll utter the names of men before you and mistake you for them in the dark. We will tangle and there will be no way to tell us apart. The night train is a current running until there's no fuel. I am moving farther away from that essential home. The train doesn't remember the stops it passed, only minds the wind and that it must exceed it. 6. When we were born, there were twin lightning storms on opposite sides of the earth, white birds colliding into blackbirds that high. 7. I had run out of fortune and still sought to own something. You had a roll of damp bills mixed with your matches. If there was music, it was gospel. New words I had learned that year, chords I held long enough to remember their element. I sniffled from cold, my coat not sufficient. You searched inside the pockets, wanting me to taste the smoke in your mouth. The train passes away, but the train passes blocks away, but the sound near enough to feel a humming in my marrow. At the intersection, the traffic light changes as the sun alters its color too, the insistence staining sky and all, crashing in every direction and then melting down, God's shattered body in the wild, blackening the dark. Thank you.
Thank you. That was beautiful. That's great. All right. It's good to see you all. So I also like poets to give introductions to their poems. And when people get so fired up about, some people really hate that. It's so weird to me. I love it. I'm not going to do it. But I'm not going to do it partly because I love it so much. I'm going to read like 7 probably poems, maybe 8. 3 in the middle are these things called the syndromes, and the syndromes are these, they're just these weird poems, and you'll notice that they're sort of in a different voice, and they're kind of a medical jargon. And there are 6 or 7 or 8 syndromes appear in the book, so I'm going to read 3 of them. So this first poem is called Bull Dragged from Arena. Bull dragged from arena, which we only barely noticed for the toreador's gilded strut beneath the stadium's swoon, hat in hand, the occasional rose twisting through the air to his feet, dragged limp and drooling by horses adorned with ribbons and bells. Glass. The father slurped the stew, wide-eyed and wolf-mouthed as was his way to do at these meals they made him since their ma was gone. His eyes white as stone, the gruel and sweat run down his neck, moaning like a bull elk in rut. They sat mute at dinner since he gagged their ma with the steel bit pried from the dead horse the day after the night she woke a quake with sweat, her hand thrust toward the dark like a blind man in debt. Her dreams of drought and plagues of flies and wolves with his face eating themselves. Like a crow, it flew from her to his face. The 3 so thin, their small eyes swollen to moons, their arm hair staunch and their stretched bellies skin taut as tombstones. Mute since the youngest who, in his gait and crooked grin most favored the man, asked, "Why is mommy dressed like the dead horse?" Landing on his back with a jaw that clicked for good and his left eye gone all but blind. All 3 searched for glass, the roadside, night by night begun the night after the day their ma, gagged and bound, was dragged lucid, steel-mouthed, singing of drought and flies and wolves as the skin broke at the corners of her smile, and like an unnamed bird looking full into each child's eyes, the wolves, she sang until she was reached by the father, still with song, beneath the black hood, before he cinched it tight, and she was gone. The moon shone through each bottle or jar as they held them to the sky to be sure the glass was pure. Through the harvest time they gathered, through the snows, and well into what should have been the bloom time too, hiding the glass in burlap sacks in the culvert, their mother's wild bird song of wolves and plague, through nightmares and fevers and storms, lulling them to sleep, the wolves, smashing first in the sacks with rocks and never a word, the bottles into shards, and these million shards with their mother's stone mortar and pestle still smelling faintly of black pepper and thyme, and even more faintly of her breath and hands. They ground into a billion filaments, sucking at the tiny wrath the glass made on their hands, the wrath their hands made of their tongues. If you drew close enough to the small mound of glass shimmering in the oldest's pockets, you would likely hear chiming like 1,000 tongueless church bells, like an overgrown grave, like our hands as we chop carrots and celery and the last soft onion, each of us racked with hunger as a bird's flaccid corpse bobs in the royal, pouring spoon after spoon after spoon after spoon, one after the next, the invisible blades of light glinting at last into the stew. Hallelujah. Oh, hallelujah. Memorial syndrome, or memory. Called memorial syndrome, or memory, this condition only afflicts the very young, 12 years and less. The onset is sudden and always presents while the patient is with his or her family on vacation at a national memorial site such as Gettysburg, Little Bighorn, or Antietam. The parents of the afflicted report losing track of their children while buying knickknacks at the museum store, a Confederate cap, an Abe Lincoln beard, or eating a quick lunch at the local diner. When the children are finally recovered, they are found barefoot and silent, often in a large group of other unrelated children, wandering through the battlefields, absent-mindedly dragging, almost imperceptibly, their tiny hands along the grave markers. Most of these patients will remain silent for 2 to 4 weeks before regaining speech. In some unusual cases, they will not speak again. The burden. The burden afflicts primarily adults, though very occasionally it will present among children, which is especially urgent. The burden is characterized as the sensation of having attached to one's neck by a rope an extremely heavy load. Patients have described the load variously as a sack of rocks, a bowling ball or two, a lifeless body, an anvil. Aside from persistent fiddling with one's collar, the afflicted tend not to present any exterior manifestations of the burden. No weight gain or change of posture. Therefore, in differentiating from depression or a compressed spine, the most effective diagnostic tool is a swimming pool in which the afflicted will rapidly sink. Horologist Syndrome. Horology is the study of clocks. Horologist Syndrome. Horologist Syndrome, which is often diagnosed in conjunction with Pythagorean syndrome, most commonly afflicts people in middle adulthood, 30 to 65 years, though more diagnoses are currently being made among patients of all ages. The syndrome is characterized by the inability to place events in history prior to one's own birth. In the most benign cases, the afflicted might imagine Elvis and Michelangelo to be contemporaries, or the most recent Ice Age to have been, quote, real hard on the Pilgrims. But in most cases, which are severe, the patient might believe the 14th Amendment to have been adopted about the same time as the Magna Carta, or the European colonization of the Americas to have occurred, like when God said, let there be light. Tardiness is not a predictor of this syndrome. Mason syndrome. One of the few syndromes that afflicts large and unified groups of people, Mason syndrome is characterized by children hallucinating in common. From a distance, the activity of these children is indistinguishable from common imaginative play, but upon closer inspection is observed a peculiar industry, reverence for the smallest insect, and overwhelming quiet aside from an indistinct tune they seem to be humming together. The affliction reveals itself when any of the children are asked what he or she is doing, to which the afflicted reply, without variation, building a road. Upon mentioning that you can't see the road, they respond, without variation, We know. Poem to my child, if ever you shall be. The way the universe sat waiting to become, quietly in the nether of space and time, you too remain some cellular snuggle dangling between my legs, curled in the warm swim of my mostly quietest self. If you come to be, and who knows, I wonder, little bubble of unbudded capillaries, little one ever a swirl in my vascular galaxies, what would you think of this world that turns itself steadily into an oblivion that hurts, and hurts bad? Would you curse me, my careless caressing you into this world, or would you rise up and, mustering all your strength into that tiny throat that one day, no doubt, would grow big and strong, scream and scream and scream until you break the back of one injustice, or at least get to your knees to kiss back to life some roadkill? I have so many questions for you, for you're closer to me than anyone has ever been. Tumbling as you are this second through my heart's every chamber, your teeny mouth singing along with the half-broke workhorse's steady boom and gasp. And since we're talking today, I should tell you, though I know you sneak a peek sometimes through your father's eyes, it's a glorious day. And there are millions of leaves collecting against the curbs, and they're the most delicate shade of gold we've ever seen and must favor the transparent wings of the angels you're swimming with, little angel. And as to your mother, well, I don't know. But my guess is that lilac bursts from her throat, and she is probably both honeybee and wasp and some kind of moan to boot, and I bet she dances in the morning. But who knows? You'll swim beneath that bridge if it comes. For now, let me tell you about the bush called honeysuckle, and the sad that call it a weed, and how you could push your little sun-licked face into the throngs and breathe and breathe. Sweetness would be your name, and you would wonder why 4 of your teeth are so sharp and the tiny mountain range of your knuckles so hard. And you would throw back your head and open your mouth at the cows lowing their human songs in the field, and the pigs swimming in shit and clover, and everything on this earth, little dreamer of the new world, holy. Every raindrop and sand grain and blade of grass worthy of love and love and love. Tiny shaman, tiny blood thrust, tiny trillion cells, trillion and trillion. Little dreamer, little hard hat, little heartbeat, little best of me. I'm going to finish with this poem. It's called From My Car on Broad Street. The child's mother pulled him, and he trotted to keep up. She looked straight ahead and probably did not see the woman in her shroud of filth tucked beneath some newspapers in a framed blanket on the church steps. Did not see her boy waving to the lady, or the broken lady lifting her hand to him either. Thank you.
This is good. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think, can you hear? Are we on? Are we good?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay.
All right. Can you hear me? No? Sure. But can you hear me? Good? Okay. Thanks you guys so much for that beautiful reading.
Thank you.
It was great. And Tina, now I can't wait to read your new book either. So, so let's see. I guess I just want to get started talking about I've been thinking about lately, Nikki Finney was in town the last couple of weeks, and she was talking about, in her work, how she feels it's necessary to address things that we don't always want to talk about, the things that are difficult or ugly. And I think I see in both of you, in your work, you do address those things. You do confront the things that are ugly, violence and loss and death, and even ugliness within ourselves, the things that we're capable of. So I guess I just wanted to ask, is it important for you to address? Do you feel like it's important to address those topics, and what role does that play for you in your work?
You go first?
Okay, I'll go first. I was actually thinking about that today. I think I got a similar question at this other talk that I gave, and I think that when one of my relatives read my first book, he said, so much of it makes me so sad. He said, and I said, but isn't that a part of life, the sort of complexities of life, how difficult life can be. And then I think in the movement to the second book, I feel like I deal with sort of all these world atrocities, things that are still affecting me, and I find that it to be so necessary to actually be able to confront those difficulties of life and to not shy away from them. But then on the very flip side of it too, there's also joy. One of my students came up to me and he said, oh, all these books we've been reading, he said, they make me so sad. He goes, I feel like I'm done with sadness. I said, but then there's also complexity to the sadness, and there's also joy on the other side of it. And I feel like in this sort of third manuscript that I'm writing, I think especially with the birth of children, because I have two very, very young children, and one I gave birth to 3 months ago. I think that you want to then sort of see the flip side of it. My little boy, he's really just beginning to form words. And has everybody seen that video? It sort of has gone viral. It's called The Birth of a Word. Has anybody seen that, where this man sort of documents, he had this camera installed in his home, and from the time they brought his little boy home, they documented how he's sort of learning words. So they take the word water, which he first starts off as saying gaga, and then it moves from gaga to gotter, water. And then by the time he's 3, he says it perfectly. And so my son is just starting to say the word happy. And we will sort of be involved in a moment to me that seems actually quite average, and then he'll just look up at me and say, happy, happy. And and it really, when you think about life really kind of inspiring your work, there was that, and I feel like I really needed to write through that in the first and the second book, because how can you write, I think especially post 9/11, in the sort of environment that we're living in, and not be able to confront issues like that? I think we'd be living sort of in our own little box if we weren't writing to that. And now there's sort of the flip side to it also. I even noticed as I was reading Ross's beautiful first book, how it ends on thank you, how there's the dealing with all these really difficult things, issues having to do with the father, and how it ends sort of in gratitude. So I felt like it was those complexities and the sort of dealing of those issues, and just how beautiful it was infused it with song and litany, and then how it ended in thanks, and how I felt like it was just kind of this beautiful combination of both.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it seems like an obvious thing that's the role of poetry, to sort of address that kind of stuff. But yeah, I like the idea that it's not all, sort of exploring what is difficult and what is painful, et cetera, it sort of sheds, it also sort of allows for the light, I've been thinking about that a lot, that we understand what is good better on account of what is difficult, Yeah. But the other thing is that, part of, I know, with this second book, and part of my project was to sort of interrogate what are the sort of motivations, what are the things that make terribleness happen, And I don't think there's any possibility of us sort of, changing our relationship to the terrible if we don't sort of interrogate it in ourselves, So if we want less of it.
Yeah. You see that, I see in your work a sort of sympathy. You look at those things sympathetically, and it's interesting because, as Tina said, there is a joyfulness as well as, I mean, though you're examining these things that can be quite terrifying, you're also, there's a lot of joyfulness in your work as well. So there's kind of a balance there.
Yeah.
That's good. And I also see in both of when I was reading your books, there's a lot of addressing of sickness and death, illness and death. Can you talk about the role that has played in your work a little bit?
Well, yeah. I think it's interesting. Yeah, that's neat. First, my dad died 5 years ago, so that sort of has been something that is just sort of constantly, considering and meditating on that. And he comes a lot in my dreams, so he's just very sort of present with me. So it makes sense that I'd continue to be sort of thinking about him. And he's a figure in my life who remains a sort of question, sort of constantly present in my life. Like, came to my basketball games and was, a really good dad and all that. And he also was someone with whom I had a really, sort of difficult relationship. Like a good human, difficult relationship. But that sort of remains a question, and the way that he died with liver cancer, remains a sort of question, and it definitely. Someone was just asking me, like, do you feel like you have a certain kind of relationship to death because your old man died when you were pretty young, and or a relationship to mortality or something like that? And I don't know. I mean, it seems to be a lot of us get to go through that, get to experience that, but it does feel like it. There's something about the sort of I don't even know how to say that you're required to sort of meditate on something differently, on how quickly they're here, and then they're not.
And I think, I think as I was writing the first book and writing all these poems, and it's interesting because my father had also died of liver cancer. So, and it was very quick. We had been living in Oklahoma, of all places, where I was born. People ask me all the time, why was I born in Oklahoma? And my father, he was a soil physicist, and he was doing some work there, and then they discovered that he had liver cancer, and we very quickly came to New York to go to Sloan Kettering so he can get treatment. And then my mom had rented out an apartment thinking that they were going to bring him there. We were going to bring him back, and then we never brought him back because it passed so quickly. It was like 2 weeks and he was gone. So the reason why I'm even telling that story is because when I think about death, and I think about interrogating this idea of death, like after I wrote all those poems, I didn't actually necessarily feel closer to death, or that I presumed to understand death at all. I don't think that I did. And I don't know if anybody ever does. I require so many of my students to read Sharon Olds' The Father, and only because I think it's such a practice and an exercise for one poet to really try to understand actually the process, not of death, but of someone dying right before their eyes. And so many of my students, they have a very difficult time with that book, The Father, because they think like it's so exhaustive. It's a very exhausting book for anybody who's ever read it, because you really follow the speaker from finding out that her father is ill to the time that he has died, and then even after death, she sort of writes from his voice from being in the grave. And so it's so exhausting, and it's the kind of book where I feel so tired after I've read it. And I say that in the best of ways. I like a book, I can put down a book, and the book makes me feel so exhausted, like I'm spent after I've read the book. And I thought, what an amazing feeling, in a way, to feel that emotional from a book, as if I just have to lie down after I've read it. And so when I started writing these poems, and I felt that they were more like a dedication to my father, as opposed to really presuming that I understand death. Because when I actually think about death right now, and if I were sort of encountering it, I think that I would still be scared. I would be scared of it. So I don't presume that I'm closer, that I know anything about it. But I think that it was more sort of a confrontation of really trying to understand that period of time.
And recently I'd gone to Pratt, and there were these incredibly interesting questions because they were from architects. And they were questions that I never received from other poets, like, you know, how do you feel like your specific language developed? Like, if your language were a structure or a building, how would you say that you built it from the ground up? And I'm like, that is a hard question. I don't know. But I think that, you know, I think that when we're making our own language, and this is something that I'm working with all of my students, and for me, it is sort of like a matter of life and death. Like, find your voice. Like, what is your voice? And I think it's so difficult for me to answer that question for myself. Like, what is that my voice, and where did it come from? It's something so instinctual, but I know that a core of it, or like the base of it, came from that moment that my father died. I felt like that was, and I was so young, I was 2 years old, and I felt like that's when I started to really confront language and what it meant, because as soon as he died, I was shipped off to another country because my mother couldn't afford to keep us here. She had no idea she would be a widow at you know, such a young age. So I was shipped to Taiwan, and so at that age of being 2, you're sort of learning English. I was learning English, and all of a sudden I was kind of thrust into another country where I was learning another language. So by death, I was sort of like located in another sort of region, and then had to confront my ideas of language and what my own language was. So I know that death and language somehow became partners in some way in terms of fashioning my own language, and I never really came to realize that until this group of architects. They were, you know, asking me questions I couldn't answer. Wow. But then I went home, and it's sort of like that thing where you're sitting in class and you're like, I don't know the answer to the question when you're a student, and then when I went home, I really thought about it for a long time, and those answers just started coming to me in terms of relationship to death.
Yeah. It's very interesting how those are linked. You know, this event in your life can affect the way that your language, your idea of language works. And it makes you wonder, Ross, do you have, I mean, I don't want to ask the architect question and totally stump you, but I do wonder, do you have an idea for you of where your language comes from? What you know, part of your history, or do you feel like the way that you speak is formed by your background? I mean, how do you think that your biography plays out in the way you use words?
God, that's so hard. Yeah, I don't know. You know, I really don't know.
Maybe you'll have to think about it, and then come like a year later, you'll have an answer like Tina does.
I have to go home. I have to think about it for a little while. I mean, my answer was like, I don't know, too. But I oftentimes feel that it's also not one particular thing. Yeah. I think it's really a series of events in one's life that then shapes the voice. And I think also, the work that I do with my students, and it really means so much to me that they are finding their own voice. It makes me so angry when they tell me that they've had a teacher who somehow wants them to write like them. And the first thing that I say to my students is, like, I want you to write like you, and it'll be your life's effort to find out what that sounds like.
Well, that takes a long time, I think, for a lot of poets.
For a lot of poets. I mean, I think even as there's so many poets in the audience, and poets who I know who, you know, even if you come out with your second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth book, it's your voice is, in a sense, yours and yours only, and in a way it's also altering and changing just as you alter and change, and you have, and then when you have different influences come into your life that are even non-literary, like, you know, the birth of children, understanding this different side of life, it then sort of alters the way you sort of hear yourself. And I feel like you're always having a conversation with yourself, but I think that when I'm talking with my students it's about that initial establishment of their voice and trusting whatever it is that is, like even outside of influences, because I think that the hardest thing for them to sort of decipher is, well, or they've asked me this, they said, how do I decipher between my voice and the sort of combination of all the influences that I've had, that people that I love? How do I know that I don't sound like a combination of people that I love, like John Ashbery and Sylvia Plath? Like, how do I know I'm not like just a combo of that? And it's really a hard question, because it kind of goes back to the question that was posed to Ross. It's like this constant, consistent interrogation and listening to oneself. It's really hard to know what that is, and it's just a matter of like just a series of discoveries throughout someone's writing process.
But isn't it the case too that we are, like, in fact, we're like a combination of John Ashbery and Sylvia Plath and our nanas and our papas and our mothers and our fathers and our brothers and sisters, and you know. It's interesting, I'm glad you brought up that idea of voice, because I'm always like, I sort of, when students, I trouble the idea of like finding the voice. I'm always like, well, there's so many voices. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's such a struggle. It's like a fundamental struggle. And I feel like, because like from minute to minute we change, in fact, right? So yeah, when you sort of said like, what are the sort of whatever foundational events or biographical things like that, yeah, I feel like, you know, when after this reading, like there's going to be a little bit of, you know, Tina Chang in my poems. It's like, and I feel
about are you concerned with the originality of your voice?
No.
Do you have a lot of time?
No. I mean, every once in a while I'll feel embarrassed and I'll be like, oh man, I totally ripped that off, you know. But I also feel like, you know, I think it's really lovely that my hands look like my grandfather's hands. I think that's beautiful, you know. Or when someone tells me like, oh look, you know, or you got the same mouth as so and so, and I like that,
right.
You know. And I learned how to talk from listening to people.
Yeah.
And then there's also that, you know, there's got to be, I was thinking like we are a composite of all these things, and then there has to also be that essential self. Just like I say to my students all the time, you know, as soon as you get on the phone and you're talking to someone, you barely have to even breathe, and they know it's you. They say, hi, it's Jesse, or hi, it's Ross. They know that it's you. When you're walking down the street, it's like there's this essential self that is only you, that is both a composite of all the people that you know, and also something that is your being, whatever it is. And I think that's the struggle for every writer, as you know, for every writer to be able to tap into that, whatever that is. I find that to be the greatest struggle for my students. Like, how do I hear myself? Sometimes it's so difficult because I hear all the noises of all the people that have come before me, the noise and the ruckus and the beauty. It's like, how do I shut that out when I'm trying to just like listen to myself finally? And that's the eternal struggle. I think for all artists, not just writers, for visual artists as well who've been influenced by Basquiat or Pollock. Like, how do I know I'm not doing that? You know, how do I know I'm just me? So that's the sort of process that we're going through, I think, all the time. It never stops.
Yeah. I think for some people, their way of getting around that is to just kind of get away from the idea of that there is an authentic self, and they just try to divorce themselves from writing from experience or writing from a voice that they think is essentially theirs. Do you think that there's something that can be accomplished by kind of just trying to step away from that idea, step away from the idea of poetry as an expression of that authentic self, of, you know, that voice you're talking about? Or for you, is it just like they're tied together? There's like one, you know, that voice is the artistic expression.
I mean, I'm in the camp that voice is the expression of the essential self. I mean, the other day I was sitting with one of my students and we were talking about just the ferocity and the passion behind her voice. I don't know if she's here today, but I promise I won't mention your name. But we were talking and she said something so interesting to me. I said, you know, you have these poems and they sound like they're sort of edging on being experimental, and then you have these other poems that feel so incredibly traditional to me, and I wonder, like, is there a marriage, like, of that? Like, how is your voice coming into being? And she said, you know, sometimes I'm trying to decide, am I experimental poet or am I a traditional poet? And I'm like, is that all there is? You know, just these two choices of like what you're going to be. And when I went home, I also thought about it because, you know, my students always educate me, even just with their questions. And I went home and I thought, I don't know, I don't think it's actually a choice that you make. And I think that with just so many MFA programs and so many journals that sometimes there's this like kind of external, sometimes superficial sounds mean, and I'm not trying to be mean. Like sometimes there's superficial influences that really shouldn't be part of the making and the shaping and the realizing of one's own voice. It should be something that we're listening to if we listen hard enough, although I'm saying as if it's easy, but it's not easy at all. It's quite difficult. But I don't think the choices are like A or B. You know, I think it's like shutting it out as much as possible and trying to find like some sort of blueprint or map to whatever it is that is going to essentially be your voice at the end.
Ross, what do you think about that idea of there being two choices, experimental, traditional? I do see that a lot with poets, the idea that they feel that they're in one place or the other. Do you see that happening? Do you feel like there's a pressure to be in one area or the other?
I mean, I hear people talk about it. It seems silly was a word, but I don't want to be mean. I mean, it just seems, it seems simplistic, you know. But I was thinking maybe there's something about, because I think I'm probably more, I sort of imagine that there's a kind of, the self kind of does more like this. Or maybe it sort of circles around trying to find ways of sort of modes of a kind of, you know, authentic whatever expression or something like that. And maybe what's interesting to me is like the way that poems sort of dramatize the struggle of that thing to emerge, you know. And not that like it ever emerges like, oh, that's really it, but maybe the ways that poems can sort of actually dramatize that struggle and that, you know, that trying, you know.
Yeah. So another thing that I've been hearing a lot lately is I keep on hearing people quoting Audre Lorde, and I think she's actually the epigraph in the beginning of your second book. And they're quoting her essay, "Poetry is not a luxury," which I'm hearing a lot. And also, you know, in this essay, she's talking about the idea of poetry as illumination. And she says, "It is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are, until the poem, nameless and formless, about to be birthed but already felt." Do you feel this is true? Do you think that poetry is an essential thing and that it's relevant? I mean, I think poets are always concerned about this idea of poetry's relevance in American society. Do you worry about that? Do you think it is relevant and essential?
I mean, I just want to tell this story, and it's a quick story. It's a short story. It's microfiction. I was teaching a workshop for these kids at, I mean, they're like probably like 16 to maybe they're up to like 20, but at a place called Isles Youth Build, and we were reading the essay, "Poetry is not a luxury," and it's mostly all, you know, kids from Trenton, and it's probably it's a school they're trying to get them through school, you know. And we were reading the essay, you know, and, you know, this one kid, he was just sort of doing this kind of amazing, brilliant, you know, it almost felt mathematical the way he was sort of making these sort of like, I think they're called syllogisms or something in his head. But he eventually came down to saying that, you know, people are poems, you know, people are poems, you know. And then it was like, oh, right. So you're not a luxury. You're essential, you know. That's what this kid came up with, like this 17-year-old kid. Like we're poems. We're poems. We're always sort of in a state of being. We're always, you know, sort of trying to illuminate things, blah, blah, blah. You know?
Yeah.
So, which makes me think, well, yeah, if people are poems, if poems are people, yeah, it's not a luxury. It's essential. It's required. It's a necessity. Anyway, that's what some 17-year-old kid told me.
That's interesting. I mean, basically, it's like valuing poetry. What he's saying is valuing poetry is you value poetry as you value life.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
and you can lose life.
Yeah.
And life is precious.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'm gonna use that. I'm gonna use that from now on.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we're really lucky because the people that are sitting in this room already, I feel like, you know, we don't have to win them over because they already know that. They already feel that poetry is essential. And I think that the largest lesson, like, you know, when I took on this role of being Poet Laureate of Brooklyn, one of the things that I really encountered is that there is a huge population who doesn't even regard that question, you know, and what to do. Like, is it then people say, what is your job? You know, like, what do you do actually as Poet Laureate? And you know, I really had to think about that as well, you know, when I took on the job, which is, by the way, like unpaid. So, you know, everything involving poetry is unpaid, as if you're some sort of saint or martyr and you're doing it out of the goodness of your heart. Then I was thinking, then that equals that all poets are good people. And that's not necessarily the case. But when I took it on, I was thinking, why did I take on this role? You know, what does it mean to me? And what is it that I actually want to accomplish in this role? And when I took it on, I think that outside of this room, like outside of the sphere where people really care about poetry and they care enough to come to a craft talk on poetry, there's a world out there of people
who don't even regard that question, who, when I was, younger growing up and hadn't found my group of poets, that they're like, I don't get poetry, I don't get it at all, I don't read it, I don't think about reading it. And I think that somehow that became like my larger work. How am I then going to entice people to come into this world so that they then feel that it's essential? Or should that be my work? Should that be my work? If I am a poet, is it enough to just write my poetry? Or should my work be elsewhere, where I'm trying to welcome people into this world? And so that has actually been my project over, I've had this role for about a year, and now I'm actually going into places where, like Lehman Brothers, all these, business places, like, trying to teach people, like, hey, if you could read a letter and be moved by it, if you could read, if you could even write like one line that has moved yourself, that you felt like, I wrote that line and I almost cried, that you have this ability to access this deeper part of yourself. And I think you're just kind of a little bit intimidated by the line breaks, like line breaks, like for some reason when people see line breaks and they see a stanza, they're like, oh my goodness, they become so afraid. And I don't know where this fear maybe came from, perhaps somewhere in their education where they had a teacher that said, what does this poem mean? And because they didn't know exactly the answer, maybe they were intimidated to think like there is one right answer, then maybe it made them kind of shy away from it. So my work has been to try to go into different places to like start from the basics and say, let's just read a couple of lines together and let's just talk about what it makes us feel, as opposed to saying like, what is the meaning of this, black and white. Like there's just no straight answer like that. So, I of course think it's essential. And now it's been sort of, well, what about the people out there, and how am I going to get them onto my side, of being convinced in the same way.
Yeah.
So it's work. I mean, tomorrow, for instance, tomorrow morning I'm waking up and I'm going to a nursing home in Brooklyn. I never thought in my life that, I'm going to be writing poems and then I'll find myself in a place where there's the aging and the elderly, and I'll be sitting there and I'll be listening to their poems. And I thought, what an interesting project, because it's combined with this Alzheimer's project. And I thought, how interesting is that, to sit there and listen to people's poems who have this very complicated relationship to memory, that they can't even remember certain things in their lives that were a part of their life. And what's it like to sit in the audience and listen to them try so hard to make these poems and access their past? So it's kind of just allowing me to kind of go into these different places to hear about what they're doing, and then also to hopefully win them over and convince them as well.
Do you think about that, either of you, when you're writing poetry, about how it's going to be received? If you're, do you think about your reaching out and kind of grabbing people and getting them on your side when you're writing? Is that something that you want? Something that being understood, really, essentially, is that something that you're grasping after with your poems?
I'm tired of me. I think that when I sit down to write a poem and I'm starting to write a poem, it's never really my concern whether or not somebody is understanding it or not. I just know that there is an urgent feeling, an urgency of something that is born inside the self that needs to get out. And then I think that when it hits the air and when you're actually sitting in front of an audience, it's a very different experience, where then you're confronted sometimes with the idea, did that audience really understand what it is that I've been saying? I had a professor at Columbia who said, I was with an audience last night, and I have to tell you, I don't think that there was one person in the audience who really understood a word I was saying, because her poems, like she said, when I'm writing them, they feel so very intimate to me. And when they were hitting the air, I actually don't think that anybody understood. And I remember one person actually coming up to me one day at a reading I did in LA, and he said, I did not understand that poem at all, and I need to sit down with you and talk about it. And I said, if that's what you need, that's what I'll give to you, because It does feel important to me in the end that it's not hitting deaf ears, because I think part of the reason why I even began writing is because I was this kind of very shy, introverted person who felt very misunderstood in the world, of not being able to communicate verbally very well with people, kind of getting stuck in the things that I said and not saying it very eloquently. And then when I was sitting down with a piece of paper, that's where I felt the most at home. And that's where I felt the most realized and the most fulfilled. And I thought, if all of those efforts sort of like then do not communicate with someone else, then what can I do? But as I'm sitting there at the moment in urgency, I don't necessarily feel the need to be understood at that moment.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an after.
It's an afterthought.
Afterwards, you're like, oh.
Yeah. And and that could also be another part of the writing process, is that, I'm thinking, what element of the poem didn't reach someone? That is actually of concern to me, because if we're only writing for ourselves, then the question is, does it become then therapy? And and whenever my students say I write because it's therapeutic, it's hard for me to take. It's like cringe, because I think that there is a communicative aspect where the poem then becomes for everyone, hopefully.
Well, yeah,
in the best of
circumstances.
circumstances.
So.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, when you put it into a book and sell it, hopefully people are
reaching out, back and not
it.
rescinding, and not stepping back from you. That would be good. Yeah.
So for you, is that a concern, being understood?
Yeah. I want to communicate. I write poems to communicate. And it's the second step. Like the first step is sort of, trying to get closer to, trying to illuminate the question that I start, the poem with.
Yeah.
But the second thing is that I want to communicate with people. And I also, I feel like I live in Bloomington, Indiana. It's a smallish town. I mean, it's, I don't know, there's 70 or 80,000 people in it. But, I mean, there's something about, one thing I think it's important for us to remember is that people have poetry in their lives, whether they're sort of calling it poetry or not. Like people go to church, or people listen to music and memorize all these songs. There's so many lyrics, some of which are probably pretty good. People consider their dreams seriously. There are all of these ways that it's just like it's like half a step away, to me. So often when I feel like, often the idea of people not being with us, I feel like, nah, they're with us, Poetry is very much in people's lives, but we need to sort of complicate probably the definitions of poetry for our benefit, and for everyone's benefit, I suppose, But that said, I live in this small town, and I've sort of had the pleasure of, I work with this chapbook press called Q Avenue Books, and we publish nice little handmade chapbooks. And there's this guy in town named Chris Mattingly, an amazing poet. And, people who are his friends who have never been to poetry readings would say, I don't give a shit about poetry. Come and love his poems. They love them,
right.
He's a really good poet, but it's also something about these people love this guy. So they're like, I'm gonna work on it. I'm gonna figure this out. I'm gonna, I don't know exactly what he's saying there, but it's okay. Or maybe I'm just gonna sit down and ask him what he means there. So I think there's something, I'm not exactly sure the point of what I'm saying, but sort of what I'm saying is there's something about being in a community of people who care about you, and the lengths that they will go to sort of understand what you do and what you love, in the same way that you will for someone that you care about or love.
So we're kind of like little ambassadors, all of us.
In some way, that might be it. It's like, it's like if my neighbor is a farmer and I care about my neighbor, I'm like, so what's it like? How's the tractor working today? Or you have a lot of worms in your soil? Can I help you with your composting?
Right.
That feels like the truth. And I've been giving readings in Bloomington, and I have guys, like this one guy, he's the mushroom guy at the market. I don't know, he might have a literature degree, he might not, I don't know. But it feels really sweet, to have these people who are not like, we think of our team, like we're talking to other poets so often,
Yeah.
I think it's lovely to have folks, and important, and, should be happening.
So we're talking about poetry in America and poetry, where its role is right now and where we are and with our relationship to poetry. Well, I'm wondering now, what do you feel the landscape is right now for minority poets? Do you think like it's changed recently? What do you see out there for people who are writing from the margins, basically?
I'll say that, with Cave Canem, with Kundiman, and other organizations, things have just radically changed. I think it's been, 11, 12 years now? 15 years. 15 years, yeah, right. God. So I know from the 15 years ago to now, totally different thing, and, I'm sort of more expert on the Cave Canem, like sort of the way that we have entered things. But like to think about like prizes and publications and posts at universities and whatever, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I feel like that's changed significantly, can always be better.
Yeah.
Which is why keep doing the work.
Here.
Yeah, that's why we keep doing the work. That's right.
Well, I can say, I think that there's no more exciting time than right now. Before I mentioned, post 9/11, and when I was making this anthology, which focuses on poetry from the Middle East and Asia and the United States, it was just a boom of all of this poetry from around the world that I didn't even really feel like I had an opportunity to recognize. Much of what it is that we study here, I can't say across the board, but we usually, or the people that I know, we've started out with the American poets. And I feel like more and more and more, it's really essential, not even just when I think of writers from the margin, I think like, for me, the margin means like expanding out and out and out and out. And that means really, if we're truly blessed to sort of be involved somehow with the word and understanding the word, then we have to understand like words from other locations and places, and not only American poets. That's so much of my work with my own students is, yes, we read the American poets, absolutely essential to what it is that we are trying to study. And then after we do that, or maybe at the same time, trying to understand poetry that is not of this United States. Just like when we're reading newspapers, it's so essential that we're not reading newspapers that are only published in the United States, that we're reading newspapers in other countries that somehow give us an education and a perspective that is not only American, that we then can start to see what our Americanness through the lens of other places and other countries. And I think the same goes with poetry. How is American poetry viewed by, or American poets viewed by other countries that are like, the people who influenced me the most were the Latin poets, Lorca and Neruda. There's so many. Those were the poets. The Latin poets were the poets that I was obsessed with when I started out, and I felt like they still are. They're still like at the core of why it is that I'm writing. There's so much passion behind their words. So when I think of it, I think, yes, definitely being an Asian American poet, but I feel like my influences are really, truly worldwide. Like when I think of Nazim Hikmet, who's one of my favorite poets, it's a Turkish poet, Mahmoud Darwish, he's a Middle Eastern poet, Bei Dao, who's a Chinese poet. It's like, how can we not know these absolutely essential voices in these other countries? We must know that in order to understand what we're doing here in the United States. They have a conversation with each other.
Yeah. I do sometimes see a certain shyness in younger writers that they're worried that, trying to expand their scope, they're not going to understand, they're not going to know. And I think that's true. It's good to expand and like try and gain a better understanding of ourselves that way.
Yeah, and at the same time, on the flip side, I feel like I have so many students coming to me, bringing me new work or translating work on their own from other countries. They're bringing new stuff to me all the time, and I find that to be really exciting and education for me.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I have one more question for you guys before we take questions from the audience. I'm just wondering a little bit about your process. So both of you now have 2 books out. And wonder first what the experience is like for you, how it's changed from the first to the second, and also when you're writing now that you have these books out, are you thinking about this is the next book, or are you just writing poems?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to start?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the end of the semester, so I'm not writing poems at all. I'm reading poems, pretty good poems too. Though, as soon as I sort of shipped the book off and was mostly done thinking about it, I was so happy to just be done with that thing and thinking about other poems and having way different strategies. I was really excited to sort of like start writing, sort of personal lyrics, again. But now it's been basically, I don't know, like a year and a half since they got the book, more or less. And now I'm starting to feel like, man, I gotta start figuring out like what can I really, write toward. I feel like just thinking about, individual poems, I'm feeling a little bit of a struggle, a little bit of a tension. I'm not sure. I feel lost. And I think it's okay. I think it's okay.
Well, I also think that it's not. There's nothing more humbling than starting a book. There is no more humbling feeling in the world for any artist to start like a new project. It makes you feel like you're starting from square one. It makes you feel like you're being born again. It makes you feel like you're a student of everything. Because when I finished the first one, the second one, I felt like with the first one, I was almost writing from a place of naivete, meaning like I was just writing. I was studying. I was getting my MFA, and all the poems just sort of gushing forth, and I didn't even know that it was going to make a book. I didn't even know there was a book in my future, and then it started shaping itself into a book, and people said, "Oh, think about publishing a book." And so I thought, hey, maybe this is a possibility. And then once that's done, people say to me, "Oh, the second book is so much more difficult." I'm like, "What could be harder than the first book? Okay, don't get me down." And so the second book. In certain ways, it was more difficult because you have and I don't know if it was Tony Hoagland that was saying this, you have such a wealth of knowledge at that point when you get to your second book. There's so much it is that you've learned from writing your first book. There's so many more influences from that point on that there's almost like a kind of nervousness, like can I rise to the occasion again? And do I have a new project on my hands? Like, do I have a new vision for this book? And I think that there are just certain additional pressures that you didn't really quite recognize with the first one when you're writing from a place of youth. And when I say youth, I don't mean age youth. You're writing from a place of youth. You're like your own literary youth, which is so beautiful, naive, and pure. It's so pure because you have no cognizance that it's going to be a book. You just know you're writing individual poems, and the day that it starts to kind of very organically come together is a very, very beautiful feeling that you could never repeat again. So because with the second book, there's just so much more knowledge that you have there, and you're like, okay, well now I'm writing a second book, and the word book is almost like stalking you, and you're like, ta-dum, ta-dum, it's like, book, so with the third and the fourth book, I feel like there's more and more knowledge each time it comes around. I think Stanley Kunitz, who was the oldest living poet, he had said, once you're done sort of kind of combing through your life for all of these topics and subject matter, at the end of your life and you're kind of done with all the subjects, like what do you do? What do you do once you've written of the father and of the mother, of the sort of lyric poems of your life? Like, what do you do at the end of your life when he was 100? What do you do at the age of 100? So he says you have to sort of mine this sort of secret territory that you've never done before, that it's even more work than it ever has been before. So I just see it as more and more and more work. Just like as you're aging, it's more and more and more work. And it's that kind of going back to what my mom said. She said, life is hard. And only now am I realizing with raising children and having to balance that out with my creative life and trying to have a romantic life, trying to be a person, that I realize it's so true. Yes, life is hard. And then the creative life is hard too. It is both a joy. It's like raising children. It is both the most amazing, complex joy. And it also is a tremendous difficulty to always contemplate what your next creative project will be. And that's for everyone. It's not just for me. So I have such tremendous admiration for artists and writers to like kind of tackle it every single day. And especially if they've been away from it for a while. It's like I've been away from it for a little while just because of this Poet Laureate stuff and trying to be very outward with my efforts. It's like to be able to go back to it again is this huge effort. You know, I tell my students all the time, go back to it, go back to it. If you've been away from it, revisit it again. It's so hard because I have to honor that too. I have to do that all the time as well. I have to do what I tell them to do. So every day when I come back from class, I think, I got to do what I'm telling them to do. And I have to not be BSing them. You know, I have to actually live what I preach, you know, practice what you preach. So that's a lesson for me.
Yeah. All right, do we have questions?
Hello. Hi, Camille. Thank you for sharing that, your beautiful poetry. My question, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about what I struggle with is letting go of the poetry that I write because it's kind of like, I don't know, it feels like my personal baby almost, you know. And I have written a few poems and I want to share, but then I get selfish with them and I don't want to. I don't know. I just want to know, what do you do and how do you know that it's okay to let go of your babies, you know?
How do you know it's okay to let go of your babies in the world? You know, it's like, how do we know, right? No, I'm responding to that question. It's like, how do we know to let go of our children one day? You know, it's like it's a very difficult place to be in, especially for people who are starting out to do that. I think after maybe you've done it for a little while, there's a sense of very slight distance. You both are that person that has written those poems, and those poems are so important to who you are. And then you're also this other person who's very robotic in terms of like slipping the poem into the envelope and making sure it's in the world. You know, it's a matter of almost kind of forcing yourself to just make the movement. Like I tell people who are really struggling with that. I said, you know what you go out and do? You go to Staples and you buy the envelopes, and then the next day you go and you buy the postage stamps, and then you print out your poems and you put them in the envelope and you say goodbye. And that's as almost as like mechanical as it gets, because you almost have to let that sort of emotional side of yourself go for a little while and say, yes, these poems are born from me, and if they're that important to me, now it's time to truly let them go and let me place them in this envelope and have some sort of faith in the process of like sending them out. And isn't that such a, it's kind of almost a spiritual thing that happens, because I was telling people, I was giving a talk the other day and I said that I have this fantasy that I open up my mailbox and there's a letter to me, and it says, "Dear Tina, congratulations, you're amazing." And I guess it's sort of like the equivalent of getting an acceptance from. I imagine that that's essentially what the editor is saying, is like, you are amazing, even though they haven't actually said those exact words. But there is either one or the other. So when you send your things out into the world, there's one of two things that could happen: an acceptance or a rejection, or maybe there's a third.
Nice rejection.
The third is like a nice rejection where it says, it's a little note. They kind of cross out the sort of like thing that they send out to everyone. They said, you know, not these particular poems, but you have something. Keep sending next year, in parentheses, you know, like not now. Like, so there are only those three things that could actually happen. So I say to myself, I can deal with those three options. Like, I think I can. Like, I can either deal with the rejection, the acceptance, or the maybe next time. And if I sort of like put them to those categories for myself, it makes it a lot easier. I mean, everybody's different, you know, but it makes it a lot easier for me to actually kind of walk to the post office and place my faith in that process of feeling like someone's on the other end who will actually hear what I'm saying and find some kind of, at least literary value in it. I don't know if you have something to add to it.
It's just going through my head, like, we are not our poems.
Mm-hmm.
But we are. I thought you just said that we are.
That's the question. Are we or are we not, right? So are we?
Yeah. I think a part of it is, I mean, it seems like it's like, is the poem done? That's another question. That's a hard decision to make.
Yeah.
Allison?
Yeah, this is sort of a statement and a question for you, Ross. Your first book which I loved, even the cover, felt in some ways very familiar to me and comfortable, both in terms of your aesthetic and also the content. And your second book, I experienced as a completely other animal, and in some places I was discomfited. And I also appreciated that you were taking many more linguistic and technical risks with the poems. And it made me feel as though I knew you as a poet much more intimately, because I felt that you trusted us, your readers, more, that you would experiment and put yourself out there. And it also felt like a book in a journey for me. I'm waiting for your third book, because I experienced your first book as it was kind of wrapped up in a way. This one feels open-ended to me, not resolved, and therefore exciting and also anticipatory. And the question part is, I don't know if any of that resonates with you, but that's how I experienced it as a reader. But the question part is the poem, the title poem that is written in 2 versions. I found so instructive about life and about agency and possibility and chance. And I also found it in some ways an instruction about writing a poem, and I'm wondering if any of that intention was behind the rewrite.
Well, to me, so the poem, if you don't know it, it's the title poem, Bringing the Shovel Down. There's a sort of very basically the story. It's a story of a boy who gets told that a dog is going to hurt him, and he kills the dog. And then in the second version, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't tell it.
Tell it.
Yeah.
Tell it? Okay.
Yeah, and then they'll have to read the poem.
Yeah, that's it.
There's so much more to it, of course. So.
Yeah. So in the second version, the boy, for some good reason, lucky reason, he gets to see that the dog is actually a sort of an animal and is not, is suffering. And he doesn't have to kill it. To me, I wrote that first poem. I mean, I'm glad you said that. I'm glad also that you said that the book feels sort of unresolved to you. That just feels good to me. But those 2 poems are truly the heart to me. That sort of potential for conversion is truly the heart of the book. And the way I sort of imagine my writing, what I want my writing to do is to sort of instruct me, inform, illuminate something for me. That's when I feel like a poem is successful. If I've gotten to a place of sort of illumination, something that I did not have before. I don't want to write poems that affirm me. I don't want to write poems that sort of cement what I already know. I want to write poems that sort of transform me. And in a way, I think those 2 poems sort of dramatize or enact that transformation. The opportunity for that boy to sort of turn to see something new, to understand that the thing that was sort of, in his mind was terrorizing him was actually this thing that he should actually love, was a sort of big sort of spiritual sort of realization for me. And it feels like that's the heart of the book. That's the heart of the book. It does kind of model in a way like what I hope my experience writing a poem is, for sure. That sort of transformation and that sort of turning, like new knowledge. I want new something. I want, not new like with big signs, but deep. So yeah, I'm just glad that sort of is your response. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I don't know if this is an old question, but I'm really curious with both of you at what point or what the process was of realizing that poetry was enough and not needing anymore someone telling you you had a voice, so you should work on it, or you should be a poet and something else, or if that never came, or if it was always there. I'm just curious about that.
Could you say it a little bit more?
I don't know, maybe just deciding that those were your shoes.
Being a poet.
Yeah. And
Is
how?
it kind of like that moment that you're like, yes, I am a poet? You don't
Yeah,
need
nobody needs to even encourage you anymore.
Do you define yourself that way to people? Like, yeah, hi, I'm Ross, I'm a poet. Is that something that you...
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I sort of, it's one of the things that I do, you know. I also love to garden, you know, and I spend as much time sort of, God, if you knew what I was really doing all the time, it's like drawing sketches of my garden. That's what I'm doing all the time, you know. And I'm reading about like container planting, and I'm reading about like, you know, dwarf trees and stuff. So I feel very much like this is one of the things that I do, and I love to do it, you know, writing poems, and it instructs me, and it brings me great joy. It brings me great joy in the way that most of the things that bring me great joy do. Like, it allows me to sort of drop out of time. You know, I play a lot of basketball. When I play basketball, well, time stops. You know, when I'm gardening, time stops. You know, when I'm writing poems, well, time stops. And I don't feel like, I feel like I'd be bummed if any of those things was out of my life. They all feel vital to me. They all feel crucial to me. Just like my relationships with my friends, and, you know, all of those things. Which is a long way of saying that I feel like it's part of me. You know, it's part of what I do. And sort of my question is, like, you know, my thing about my feeling that I'm not my poems aren't me, points to that. You know. It's one of the things that I do, and the people who really love me, if I stopped writing poems today, they'd keep loving me, you know.
Well, I think that I think I spent a good deal of my life trying to actually deny that I was a poet, because I think it's a really difficult thing to be a poet. I think it was Kate Marvin, she's just a lovely poet. I love her work, and she was saying something to the effect that she was just like a little too familiar with the dollar menu at McDonald's, meaning like it could sometimes through the course of your life feel so actually quite difficult to be a poet, you know, when you're encountering people who say like, I don't understand poetry, or when you're feeling like very poor one day. I feel like almost like the odds are sort of stacked against you in terms of like being understood and all these kinds of things, that it almost is like this tremendous amount of energy to like push yourself forward, you know, in that regard. And at the same time, it's like exactly what Ross is saying, like nothing brings me more joy or satisfaction than sitting there and writing a poem and having the time and the discipline to write a poem. But I think that throughout my life, I was kind of doing everything except accepting the fact that I was a poet. I tried everything from publishing to like working in an office. I was like an assistant to a billionaire in New York, just thinking like, oh, all these things will bring me stability. And I remember Linda Gregg, who's this awesome poet, who's lived the life of a poet. She had said, you know, stability is like the poet's worst enemy, because, you know, it shouldn't be our concern to be stable. Isn't that the concern of somebody else, like a business person or something? Should we really be concerned with that? I said, when you got to feed your kids, yeah. Right? Definitely, yes. So there are those concerns, but then I think that one day I had done everything else that I could, and it was very certain, because other people told me that I am bad at certain things. And so, I actually tried being an accountant, and I tried to be so many things, like trying to pretend that I wasn't a poet, and it was almost a process of elimination, where I was so awful at everything, and like honestly almost on the verge of being fired, like, you know, this is your last opportunity. If you F up again, you know, you're out of here. And that's how bad I was at things, that I think poetry was the only thing in my life that people didn't say to me like, you're kind of like not so good at this. And I had people in my life, especially mentors and professors, who said, you can make a life out of this. And I'm like, what does a poet look like? What is a poet shaped like? How do they walk? How do they talk? So I needed to find my role models, and a lot of that was like making myself the role model for myself, because especially in sort of the Asian American realm at that point, I didn't have a ton of people that I could look at, a few. So then it was just a process of eliminating one thing after another until finally one day I arrived, and it's with a little peep that I say, I'm a poet, because I think, my mentor, who's Mark Doty, he says he still has a really hard time saying that I am a poet, because it almost seems so audacious. And so I feel like I'm of the same camp where I kind of like squeak it out, I'm a poet, I think. I know I love writing poetry, but you're right, there is a point where you decide, like, there's no turning back now. I'm not going to be the doctor that my mom had wanted me to be, or a nurse practitioner. I'm not going to be that person anymore. I've filled these shoes. Like, I'm going to be this writer now. And I think that probably happened with probably the publication of my first book, because when I saw the book and it was in my hands, I thought, oh, this is like a real thing. It's like sitting in my hands now, and I can open the pages and I could feel the pages. And it's not just up here, and it's not a figment of my imagination where I dream myself to be something. It's like, wow, it actually exists. And I think that after that came out, it was sort of like living proof, like, you're okay at something, you keep going, you're all right at it. So I think that was the point for me.
We have time for one more question, I think. Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, my question has to do with the process of writing as it relates to isolated ideas. I mean, you write a poem and it's this thing that comes to life in and of itself, and then you decide to develop it into a book. What motivates you, or what tells you what pieces belong in that collection of poetry? I mean, what really motivates that for you as an individual?
You did it more recently, I think, maybe.
I did it more recently, and there were pieces that I remember I read a couple of them to an audience, and people would come up to me and comment, or maybe have some sort of connection to it, or they just wanted to continue the conversation. They said, where can I find that poem? And I said, you can't find it anywhere, actually. You just found it here tonight. That's pretty much it, because it's actually not included in any book. And it was because I had made the decision just in terms of the book's vision, because eventually you do have a vision for, at least I do. I had a vision for my book that it fit nowhere in the book at all. Like the first poem that I read tonight, which was Patience, which had to do with this very difficult relationship with the stepfather. It's nowhere. It's kind of floating. I have no idea where it's going to be in the world, and I think that I'm finally at a place where I'm all right with that. So I think that the way that I usually think about it, and the way I usually try to guide my students when they're thinking about their own books, is that the poems that belong are the poems that have a conversation with each other. They actually start to talk to each other. The way one poem ends and the way another poem begins, they start to speak to each other in ways that I didn't even actually envision that they would. So how odd is that poems can do that? They can sort of have a life outside of you and begin to talk, have a conversation. So I think those are the poems that seem like they sort of belong together when they start to kind of live together. And I don't doubt they're living together and coupling together in that way.
That's my answer, too.
So you're serious?
Yeah, really.
All right, great. Well, I have to say that's a great answer and a great question to end on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our poets.
Thank you.
In the
Thank you
audience.
so much.